The court of higher opinion is now in session. Bring forth the accused. State your name so that all may hear.
I am the Evercade VS.
Do you have counsel?
I'll be defending the Evercade VS, Your Honor, and I'll be ready in just a jiffy.
Are you not the prosecutor?
Yeah, I am, but if no one wants to play defense, then I'm game. Win or lose, it doesn't really matter much to me. Think of it as charity.
This is most irregular. I will allow it.
All right, Your Honor, I'm ready. Let's fry this turkey.
Hell!
Let's set this birdie free.
Right. You, the Evercade VS, stand before the court of higher opinion accused of the following crimes. You're accused of having a cheap build quality, of having a lousy controller, and faulty cartridges. You are accused of suffering numerous visual and audio distortions, of relying upon emulation, of input delays, and faulty button mapping. You are accused of failing to output 1080p, in spite of advertising the capacity to do so. You are accused of failing to work with all pre-existing Evercade cartridges, and it is said that of the remaining cartridges that you do work for, that they suffer from supreme mediocrity. Mediocre game selections consisting of 30-year-old shovelware produced by obscure defunct publishers. Thus, you are accused of selling mediocre games, and you are accused of packaging your games in lame boxes with even lamer so-called full-color manuals. These are serious charges in the court of higher opinion. How do you plead?
Guilty. Oh, not guilty, Your Worship.
Very well. Let the trial commence. Bring forth evidence and demonstrate to the court that these accusations are false. Your arguments will be weighed upon the scales of justice. Either the Evercade VS is worthy of the public's money, or else it ought to be cast out into the fires of retro gaming hell, along with the NES mini scalpers, at-games consoles, and all of those horrible plug-and-play games from the 2000s.
A fate worse than death, Your Honor. We're ready.
The Evercade VS has been accused of feeling cheap and having a poor build quality. What say you?
Yes, Your Honor. If it please the court, I would like to give the Evercade VS a full examination, in addition to being a video game prosecutor and defense lawyer.
Oh boy.
I also happen to be a male nurse, so this isn't the first time that I've had to touch old junk, if you know what I mean.
This is most irregular. I will allow it.
All right. Blaze Entertainment's Evercade VS is far more sturdy and weighty than I anticipated it to be. It weighs about the same as a Nintendo Switch and is encased by a rather thick and comely plastic. A wide heat vent straddles the top of this absolute unit. There are 4 USB cable ports and a prominent gray power button that offers a nice responsive click. I found the console to be surprisingly large. It's nearly as wide as our Switch and about 4 times as deep. At the front is a nifty hatch that opens up and pops perfectly into place, revealing not 1, but 2 cartridge slots.
Interesting. Obviously, 2 slots are better than only 1.
Naturally, Your Honor. In fact, I only wish it had 3 slots, if I'm being honest. But if it please the court, I would like to satisfy both slots with these 2 Evercade cartridges, both of which are included with the premium package of the Evercade VS.
Please proceed.
As you can see, the cartridges slide into place gently, and yet firmly like so, making for a perfect fit.
Oh.
Yes, there have been some reports of cartridges being too big for the intended slot, but our examination of the defendant reveals no such problem, at least not in our case. We do know that the great Genovi had this problem with his handheld Evercade earlier in 2022. Perhaps one of us has experienced a fluke occurrence. Turning the console over, we expose its soft white underbelly. You'll notice that the Evercade VS has 4 rubber bump stops glued to the bottom, and experience tells me that these are the kind that will fall right off in the Texas summer humidity. That and your sweet candy ass. Trust me, it all just falls off here. Further, I noticed this hand-applied decal with the Blaze Entertainment logo and address. It's not flush. It's sticking off the recessed area that's intended to house it. Well, that sucks. Next time, just include include a sticker and let me apply it. I'll do a better job, guys. I know it's a minor detail, but to some of us, details really matter. That's why you all shouldn't have switched the color of your new boxes to purple. You know that lack of consistency has to really piss some people off. But other than this machine is aesthetically quite pleasing, and it's the best looking console I've owned in many years. I wonder how it would fare in a video game console beauty contest.
I'm so beautiful.
Yes, quite striking.
Unfortunately, the Evercade VS comes only with a USB micro cable that's probably intended to power the console by siphoning electricity off of your TV.
I'm a little mosquito.
They didn't include a wall adapter, but probably assumed that you'd already have a kitchen drawer full of those. Further, Your Honor, we must admit that the Evercade VS does not come with an HDMI cable.
Outrageous!
Oopsie.
Yes, Your Honor, that's what we thought too, until we realized that we have something like 20 others scattered all over the place. A trade hazard of being into retro consoles. If anything, Blaze was doing us a favor by keeping costs down and saving us the burden of yet another homeless HDMI cable, a growing and terrible social issue that needs our help now. For only $75 a day, we can source funds to build a 5 million square foot shelter in a cornfield near Gothenburg, Nebraska, that could house, feed, and love the millions of purposeless, unemployed HDMI cables plaguing our living spaces as I speak right now. Call the number at the bottom of this screen, and for only $75 a day, that's just over $27,000 a year, we could create a warm, dry, safe environment for HDMI cables to endlessly plug into as many HD TVs and Blu-ray players as their hearts desire, but without the risk of disease or unwanted plug-and-plays. Together with the help of people like you, we can give the gift of hope today. But yeah, not having an HDMI cable included is no big deal. Last thing I want is more useless garbage filling up my house, you know what I mean?
Yes, moving on. From what you've shown, the Evercade VS is an attractive, sturdy little machine,
I'm a big boy.
and we are willing to forgive the absence of an HDMI cable. But before passing judgment, I must insist upon seeing the machine turned on.
Sure thing, Your Honor. Let's just press and hold this button here.
That tickles.
Ooh, and as you can see, this bad boy's got some running lights that sparkle and jam like a lady of ill repute at a rave in Bristol. And as you can see, it's turned on.
I sure am.
Without catching on fire, exploding, or melting into a puddle of goo. The boot up screen is classy and the user interface is easy on the eyes and ears as well, as the Evercade VS has some haunting vibe music that's also a lot like a lady of ill repute. The morning after a Bristol rave. All strung out and going through your wallet so she can get cigarettes and beer for breakfast. It's kinda chill, somehow still a little pretty, and yet both sad and scary at the same time. I think I like it, but I wonder if the music was the best choice. She's not exactly the kind of lady you want playing with your kids. But anyway, here are the games represented by these old school arcade posters. As you know, Your Honor, all Evercade game cartridges thus far come as multi-ROMs. That is, multi-game collections, housed in these nice little Neo Geo pocket-sized cartridges. Some have as many as 20 games, others as few as 2. It all depends on the publisher that's being represented, and every cartridge retails for about $20, or about 20 to 17 pounds in the UK. The cool thing about the Evercade VS, and the reason it has 2 slots instead of just 1, is that it allows you to mix and match these cartridges on the user interface. For instance, currently we have the 10 games of the Data East Arcade Collection plugged in side by side with the 8 games of the Technos Collection, and when we turn on the Evercade, we see that all 18 games from the combination of both cartridges are accessible in the menu. And with the tap of a button, I can reorganize the total set of games by name or chronologically according to a game's known release date.
Amazing!
Yes, and even more amazing is the fact that Blaze has made certain secret games accessible by mixing and matching the correct combination of cartridges. So for instance, you can unlock the Atari 7800 version of Dark Chambers by inserting both the Atari Collection 1 and the Atari Collection 2 into the VS at the same time. This is pretty great because not only is Dark Chambers a pretty cool little gauntlet-style dungeon crawler, but it offers 2-player simultaneous co-op, and of course, that's what the Evercade VS is all about.
Even more amazing.
Yes, it's pretty cool, and the VS gives you a lot of good options. All the stuff that's become standard in all the best retro mini consoles. You can adjust the screen resolution to either blurry, super blown up and hideous, or Pixel Perfect, which seems to actually use some sort of interpolation, ensuring that games made 30 to 40 years ago for various kinds of CRTs are not distorted on your HD TV. Retro consoles that have failed to do this in the past, such as the TurboGrafx 16 Mini, have suffered from odd visual artifacts that negatively affect games' presentation. After extensive testing, this has not proven to be the case here. The only correct option, as far as I'm concerned, is Pixel Perfect mode, but some people may hate the way this will shrink the image somewhat and leave these black borders around the screen. For me, the trade-off is plainly worth it. You can also add scan lines to games. For some reason, they always give you this option. And of course, you can pick themes and bezels for the background. And I always just go with the default black, because that's the only one that's not distracting. Then you can adjust the user interface sound levels here, and you can access a Wi-Fi network here, and this is huge. So upon setting up the Evercade VS, you're asked for access to your local Wi-Fi network. Doing so will allow the VS to download a firmware patch that will rectify a myriad of issues and complaints about the Evercade. As a company, Blaze has been vigilant about ensuring that the Evercade has some kind of future, and so at various times over the last couple of years, they've updated their hardware and even their software with firmware patches. The original run of Evercade games suffered from many audio and visual glitches that have long since been fixed. The same was apparently true with the VS at launch, but I find that most, if not all, of the complaints people had have already been fixed. For instance, the game Sly Spy on the Data East collection, which comes with the Evercade VS Premium Pack, originally suffered from an awful stuttering frame rate. However, after an update with the game set to Pixel Perfect mode, there is no such issue. In fact, the game plays as smooth as creamed gravy. So yes, having Wi-Fi network accessibility out of the box has proven to be vital, and hopefully Blaze remains vigilant in their pursuit of perfecting the Evercade. Sincerely, this company's commitment to quickly addressing and resolving as many issues as possible is commendable, and it banishes any worries that I once had about Blaze potentially being yet another fly-by-night retro gaming cash grab. That's not the case at all. Blaze is clearly in this for the long haul. They're ready to fight, and they're giving it their all. I'd also point out that the VS provides an option to remap your game controller. This is significant because one of the biggest problems facing Blaze since day one has been weird button mapping. For me, this is most noticeable on some action platformers that use both a jump button and an attack button. For me, the most natural configuration would be to map X as attack and A as my jump button, but most Evercade games default to an A-B configuration over here, and frequently A and B are functionally swapped. That is, A jumps, but B attacks, and that sucks. Thankfully, the Evercade VS button mapper is robust and easy to use. It lets me move the functionality of the B button to the X button, but it would be even better if there was a way to save these controller configurations for every game, because every game is different and sensible changes made for one game might ruin the playability of another. Finally, the Evercade VS has a secret code option. At first I thought this might be a Game Genie, but no, this has only one line for input, and if you remember the Game Genie, it had a crazy number of lines requiring input. So this is not that. But what is it, dude?
I can't tell. It's a secret.
There you go, Your Honor. That's the Evercade VS. The only thing we didn't do was take it apart and look at its insides. I really didn't want to risk killing this little guy. I'm a male nurse, you know, not a surgeon.
That's fine. We can plainly see that the Evercade VS is a meaty and stylish console with an interesting cartridge format, well-supported firmware, and quality user interface. I find the Evercade VS innocent of the charge that it's cheaply made or riddled with bugs.
Hooray!
But what of the controller?
Let's examine that too. The Evercade VS Premium Pack comes with two controllers, and they are a couple of big boys. The controller's about 25% larger than a Super Nintendo controller, and perhaps twice as heavy. It comes with a beautiful 9-foot long USB cable, and it snaps in place perfectly. There is a relatively raised D-pad that I was originally tempted to describe as mushy, but honestly, it compares favorably when compared to all of our other controllers with a D-pad. It's actually very similar to the Sega Astro City Mini, and we actually love that controller. There are also 4 action buttons that follow the traditional diamond configuration, and as with the Evercade handheld, these classy little fellers look like the pearl buttons on a cowboy's dress shirt. They click and pop back into place beautifully. Now, these boys are a bunch of straight shooters, I tell you what. On top of the controller are 4 clicky shoulder buttons, and on the face is a start button. a select button, and a well-placed special button that brings up system options during gameplay. This makes it exceptionally easy to both use and abuse save states, which is really cool if you ask me. Overall, the controller feels good, looks good, and works very well in spite of having a slightly softer and raised D-pad. This means that this controller isn't quite suitable for some old-school arcade games, such as Burger Time, because those games demand precise left-to-right input commands in order to quickly get your avatar moving in the right direction. If you're a purist, you may need to get an arcade stick.
Unacceptable.
Well, Your Honor, this has always been the case with D-pads. They're okay for a lot of games, but for games like Pac-Man, or in our case, Lock and Chase, they're hard to control well with the D-pad. 2D fighting games are the same, but we didn't have any fighting games to test here. However, Blaze confirms that the Evercade VS is compatible with 8-bit DOE products, and plenty of YouTubers have confirmed this as well. So it's possible to get a third-party arcade stick if you really want one, or if you plan on gunning for the all-time high score in Burger Time.
In that case, acceptable. We find the Evercade VS not guilty of having a bad controller, even if slightly mushy D-pads are not suitable for all arcade games. But what of the cartridges? Here is video evidence from the excellent YouTuber Genovi, struggling to insert a cartridge into an Evercade. Clearly it was sized incorrectly at the cartridge factory.
Yes, Your Honor, that was a tragic incident, but I can only speak based on our own findings, and after testing several different cartridges ourselves, 5 to be exact, we found, as we demonstrated earlier, that these bad boys slip right in and make a perfect fit. However, in the event we got Genovi'd and our cartridges didn't fit, then we have good reason to believe that Blaze would have issued a replacement. I have cataloged evidence from reading many customer testimonies online, and it seems pretty clear to me that Blaze will gladly exchange any defective products.
That's well and good, but do these cartridges actually perform well? Are there not famous reports of glaring audio glitches and crashes associated with Evercade software? Are not these so-called physical cartridges actually nothing more than emulators stuffed with ROMs dumped from the internet? And if that's the case, do these games not suffer from game-ruining emulation errors, such as crackling sound or long input delays?
Uh-oh, here we go.
Yes, Your Honor, we must admit that we've heard the tales, and that the tales be true. Many glaring defects plagued the Evercade handheld in the early days after the console's launch a couple of years ago, but I am happy to report that in our extensive examination of this machine, we have seen little evidence of such problems persisting. Again, it seems as if the firmware updates issued by Blaze were kind of a cure, as it were. However, we must admit that the Evercade is in fact emulation, and not an FPGA-style replication of authentic hardware.
Why is that important versus emulation? Like, why would you get this instead of a Raspberry Pi? We live in an imperfect physical universe. Electrons move through reality. You're not going to be able to emulate everything the electrons are doing in software.
However, the obvious trade-off here is that the Evercade is cheap, emulation is cheap, and FPGA technology is certainly not.
Now basically, the only new principle involved is that instead of power being generated by the relative motion of conductors and fluxes, it's produced by the modial interaction of magneto-reluctance and capacitive diractance.
Further, each and every Evercade cartridge utilizes a unique set of emulators in order to make these games executable on the Evercade computer, but that means there are additional computational steps required to make these games run. Sometimes emulation leads to weird glitches or changes to a game's natural appearance. A classic example is how emulators fail to replicate transparency effects in certain games. Also, emulators are notorious for input delays, which is an increase in the amount of time it takes to make a game respond to the press of a button from the player. All emulation will create some amount of input lag, since the CPU has to take extra steps to translate the game you're playing into language it can understand. But generally, this lag is imperceptible, but when it's not, it can be game-ruining. However, emulation of 16 and 8-bit computers from the 80s and 90s has come a really long way, and contemporary microprocessors have little problem replicating such games. The quad-core CPU of the Evercade has even demonstrated that it can handle the original PlayStation without noticeable compromise. In our examination of the 18 games available with the Evercade Premium Pack, we have not found anything out of place. No abnormal slowdown or perceptible input delays, no bizarre graphical errors or distorted audio. There are some games included here that suffer some peculiar technical issues, like the horrible frame rate in Double Dragon 3, but as far as we can tell, these issues are true to the original game experience. But to the Evercade's advantage, there is the fact that any subtle differences are imperceptible to us, insofar as we have no way to make a scientific comparison. Without access to the original arcade motherboards, all I can say is that the Evercade appears to run these games at least as well as the MAME emulator that most people use when they engage in video game preservation.
You mean piracy?
No, Your Honor, I mean video game preservation. Just one of the many ways that everyday heroes like you and I can do our part to preserve history by playing any game that we'd like for free. Or we can get an Evercade. That's a pretty good way too, and the games play the way they're supposed to. Mostly, I'm sure someone will find an input delay by way of special software or hardware that can measure such things. But we weren't able to find such deficiencies, and we sort of think that the people who claim to are either mad or perhaps being just a little fussy.
So these are just emulated games, but you're saying they work well enough so that there's no perceptible practical difference?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor. These games may as well be playing on their original hardware as far as I can tell. I've seen bad emulation plenty of times, and this isn't it. Perhaps the audio in Double Dragon 2 was a bit low, but I don't know if that's true of the original or not. We just turned up the volume on our TV for that game and it was fine.
Very well. We dismiss the charges of bad emulation and input delays, and all that. But what about the faulty button mapping?
Oh, jeez.
Well, as I've said, Your Honor, some games do have weird default button mapping, and this can be fixed in the system settings, but you'll have to redo this process every time you want to switch to a different game.
Then I find the Evercade VS guilty of having problematic button mapping.
Ooh, I guess we can't win them all.
What about the accusation that the Evercade VS fails to output at 1080p on an HD TV? It advertises this function on the box, yet there are reports that this is false advertising.
Yeah, I really don't know what that's about. My guess is that the people complaining about the soft or blurry output have not figured out that you can change the aspect ratio to pixel perfect mode in the settings. The first thing everyone should do is change the aspect ratio to pixel perfect mode. It solves a lot of problems.
Not guilty.
Yes, we're winning, dude.
But what of the charge that the Evercade does not work with all Evercade cartridges?
Well, it works great with almost all of the Evercade cartridges, Your Honor.
I'm going to ask again, and you answer yes or no. Does the Evercade VS work with all Evercade cartridges?
No, Your Honor, it does not. Neither of the Namco collections are compatible with the Evercade VS. Supposedly, Namco agreed to license their games for a handheld console, and Blaze was unable to negotiate a deal for the VS. So for now, the Namco cartridges won't work. I guess you're gonna have to buy both a VS and an Evercade handheld console if you want to be able to play a complete Evercade game collection. Wow, you know, it's almost like maybe this was intentional, because it certainly doesn't hurt Blaze if people are motivated to get both consoles in order to play all of the games. Anyway, all of the other cartridges work on the VS, and now it's possible to play all of these great two-player games, like Logjammers on the Mega Cats collection, or Super Dodgeball on the original Technos collection. I guess this fact explains why they call the VS the VS.
Interesting. Guilty!
Right.
No.
What about the game boxes? There are accusations of mediocrity.
What do you mean? I thought people loved them. It's the return of physical media. The collectible numbered game boxes are kind of supposed to be the point of the system.
But are the boxes good? Honestly?
They're actually quite disappointing.
Shut up, dude.
Back in the day, there was nothing like getting a new Mega Drive game. They came in these big, bulky, sturdy clamshell cases with beautiful artwork and unique manuals, often loaded with additional artwork and important details about how to play the games. As an example, here's a copy of Tommy Lasorda Baseball, which was featured on episode 56 of Zilog and Moto. I'll put a link to this video in the description, and here we can see how striking early Genesis box art can be. Someone airbrushed a beautiful portrait of former Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton right on the cover. And as the box is opened with a nice pop, you get a good sense for how firm these used to be. Inside is a cartridge bearing the same beautiful portrait, and there's the manual, an important companion to every game. And it was often the first thing that you experienced about a game during the car ride home after making a new purchase. You think texting and driving is bad? Try reading a Sega Genesis game manual while trying to drive a stick. My feet could barely reach the clutch back then. I didn't even have a license. Anyways, you can see game manuals had a lot to offer. They not only explained how to play a new game, but they often gave you context, backstory, useful hints or diagrams and interesting illustrations of items or characters found within the game. Manuals were indispensable to the complete game experience, and one of the main reasons people care about the Evercade at all is that it purports to recreate the classic Mega Drive game experience. Its cartridges all come housed in these little plastic clamshell cases, and Blaze heavily flaunts the fact that they also come with full-colored game manuals. And in theory, that sounds awesome, which is why I think the packaging for these games is one of the most disappointing things about them. Because these are all compilation carts with so many different games, that unfortunately means the box art is always generic and bland. Just look at this Mega Cat Studios cover. What does this say to you? Now compare it with the box art for Super Thunderblade on the Sega Genesis. There's no comparison. These Evercade boxes are like really bad YouTube thumbnails that try to say too much with words. But if the art's good, you shouldn't need words. Right, Tommy Lasorda? That's right, dude! The boxes are numbered and have easy to read end labels, but they also feel really flimsy and lack that satisfying pop found with real Sega Mega Drive cases. These weak cases can barely even hold together. I think it's a matter of time before I get one that won't even stay closed at all. The so-called full-colored manuals? They're here, but they're merely a gimmicky, empty gesture. All they really contain is a superficial one-page description of each game, along with a couple of screenshots. They contain no real useful information whatsoever, other than maybe a diagram featuring some of the controls, and sometimes those are wrong, and you're likely to want to remap them anyway. The Technos collection comes with a wrestling game called Mania Challenge, and you'd think that the full-colored manual would tell you how to perform the game's surprisingly diverse range of maneuvers. But no, you get nothing. I actually had to go on the internet to figure out how to play this game. The manual may as well not even exist, because it's completely useless. It's really just a brochure for the game pack, a cartridge that I already own. And while the cartridges themselves do look good and feel good, they also suffer from being a bit generic. Yeah, it's numbered collectible physical media, but it's also really not that great. This cheap generic packaging doesn't really make a good case for going back to the past. At this point, it just seems like clutter for clutter's sake.
My bad.
Guilty! Finally, what do you have to say regarding the charge of mediocrity? Many people complain that these cartridges offer little outside of obscure shovelware, or middle-of-the-road games long past their viable relevance.
Is the Evercade being accused of having shitty games, Your Honor?
Excuse me.
Yes.
It's hard to say. The Evercade VS Premium Pack comes with two cartridges, the Technos Arcade Collection and the Data East Arcade Collection. The Technos Collection has 8 games, and they really aren't that good at all. And outside of Blockout and Double Dragon, I've honestly never heard of any of these games. Minky Monkey and Battle Lane Volume 5 are both terrible. Indeed, they're pretty close to unplayable. Mania Challenge is an ancient, super primitive wrestling game that only allows you to play as one wrestler, Dynamite Tommy, who incidentally looks like the Texas Tornado Kerry Von Erich, which is alright, I guess, except that during versus mode against a human opponent, you both have to play as Dynamite Tommy at the same time. No one is ever going to want to come back to this game twice. Double Dragon 2 is included, and it's a decent yet sometimes frustrating beat-em-up that allows for 2-player co-op gameplay. If you're familiar with the NES version of this game, just keep in mind that this is basically completely different, and not really quite as much fun. And for whatever reason, the audio is really muted on the Evercade for this game. I had to crank up the volume on my TV to play, and then bring it back down afterwards. Double Dragon 3 is also on here, but it's one of the worst arcade beat-em-ups of the era, and is infamous for the invention of in-game microtransactions. Seriously, each level features a shop that asks you to insert real money on top of what you've already paid in order to unlock special moves, weapons, or power-ups. Lucky for you, Since this is emulation, you can just keep popping virtual coins into the game to your heart's content. But this concept sucks. Also, yes, the game has always been this horrendously choppy. Blockout is a boring Tetris clone with a 3D gimmick that makes gameplay painstakingly slow and tedious, and that's 6 out of 8 games that I can't really recommend. Mysterious Stones, however, surprised me, once I figured out how to actually play it, that is. It's a surprisingly deep treasure hunting based action game with some adventure elements and a few really inventive game mechanics, especially for 1984, which is when this game originally came out. Here is a perfect example of how a real colored game manual would have actually been helpful, because there's a lot more to Mysterious Stones than meets the eye. Thanks to the internet, we figured it all out, and now we thoroughly enjoy this odd, lost gem of a game. But the true star of the Technos collection turns out to be Combat Tribes, a brutal beat-em-up that lets you destroy gangbangers in a variety of violent ways. Smash them with heavy machinery, spin them around in the air, bash their brains into the concrete? Well, that's pretty dark. Combat Tribes plays like the true successor to Renegade or the original Double Dragon, and it was probably one of the best beat-em-ups ever made at the time of its release in May of 1990. Further, this game offers 3-player simultaneous co-op, making it one of the first games to make good use of the Evercade's 4 controller ports. Combat Tribes is really fun, but alongside Mysterious Stones, it's just one of the 2 games out of 8 that we can recommend on the Technos collection, and that's not very good. And had this not come packed in with the Evercade VS, we would have never bought it. Or if we did buy it, we would have been kind of disappointed. The Data East collection, on the other hand, which comes with 10 games, is a much better cartridge overall. The obvious big hits here that are going to appeal to the most people are the arcade classics Burger Time and Bad Dudes. A lot of people enjoyed both of these games back in the day, even if Burger Time can sometimes be a little aggravating. I mean, those giant anthropomorphic wieners are fast. Are the wieners giant, or is the chef just tiny? But then if the burgers are normal size, then that means the wieners are also tiny. But who makes wieners that tiny? So then maybe the burgers are just world record breaking huge. But then how do you explain that the wiener is still the same size as the man? Is it a tiny man with a regular wiener? Or could it be a regular man with a giant wiener? The proportions in this game are ridiculous. And then there's Bad Dudes vs. Dragon Ninja, a fun side-scrolling beat-em-up from 1988 that played like Kung Fu on steroids. This was a lot of dumb fun, especially with a second player, but it was probably more famous for its crazy storyline than its actual gameplay. You're on a rescue mission to save President Ronald Reagan, who's been kidnapped by an evil gang of Japanese ninjas. The game includes cutscenes featuring Ronald Reagan, who was the actual president of the United States at the time that this game was released. I mean, seeing his face in the arcades was just surreal. Can they do that? What a ballsy thing to do. But what else do you expect from a game called Bad Dudes? A lot of historians ponder about the apex of American cultural dominance in the world. Was it Hulk Hogan beating the Iron Sheik from Iran? Was it Rocky defeating Ivan Drago in Rocky IV? I personally think it might have been the time that the Bad Dudes from New York City put the boots to the evil Dragon Ninja and then enjoyed a Big Mac with Ronald Reagan. It doesn't get any more exhilaratingly American than that. Also in the Data East collection is Wizard Fire, a Dungeons & Dragons inspired isometric beat-em-up with amazing graphics and cool sounds. Wizard Fire also features a fairly elaborate cornball narrative full of animated cutscenes and really wonky dialogue. Gameplay-wise, this gets repetitive toward the end, but like Bad Dudes, most of the fun to be had here is with a friend. It's a pretty good game for at least about 20 minutes or so. Also on the Data East collection is Sly Spy, which is a corny shinobi or Gate of Thunder style action platformer featuring an unlicensed knockoff of James Bond, who parachutes into the first level, murders Saddam Hussein's army, rides a rice rocket through the streets of DC, fights tigers, and even goes scuba diving in the shark-infested ocean. Mechanically, this is bare-bones stuff, and it lacks proper button mapping, but this game is so thematically crazy and changes gears so frequently that it's totally worth playing through to the end at least once in your life. And then there's the original Magical Drop, known here as Chain Reaction. And as you might know, this was a very popular series of arcade games in the 90s. The sequels are mostly associated with the Neo Geo, but there were versions that showed up on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn in Japan. But this is the original version of the game, and it's pretty darn good. Also included on the Data East collection is the prequel to Wizard Fire, a game called Gate of Doom. That's worse in every conceivable way, but it's still worth beating at least once, with a friend. And there's Tumble and Pop, a single-screen platformer in the vein of Bubble Bobble that features vacuum cleaners that can suck up monsters and shoot them as projectiles. It's a great premise, but the execution is disappointingly mediocre, except for the boss fights, which are actually very good. It's a slog, and then the boss fights are a great payoff. Speaking of mediocre, Lock and Chase is a Pac-Man clone that's not too bad, even if it's not too good either. Also, this is one of those games that's hard to control with the Evercade VS's native controllers. In addition, there's Breakthrough, a cool little side-scrolling shooter that we actually thoroughly enjoyed thanks to the magic of save states. At the same time, we're fairly certain most people wouldn't like this tough little bastard as much as we did. Our GT85 gave up right at this point in level 1.
What the hell am I supposed to do there? You know what I'm supposed to do? Find a more fun game.
So this tip is meant for him. You've got to hold on to the jump button a little longer in order to clear the boulders. It's that simple, dude. Come on, man. Quitters never win. Unless we're talking about drugs, then winners never stop quitting.
'Cause users are losers and losers are users. So don't use drugs, don't use drugs.
And finally, there's Darwin 4078, an absolutely abysmal space shooter that we know for sure that no one is gonna like. Except for maybe the shmup junkie. He might be the one human being alive with the skill and perseverance to suffer this game. Personally, it's not the game that gets me so much as that repetitive music. So in all, that's 5 out of 10 games that we'd actually recommend. None of them are great, but all of them are good for at least some short-term amusement. However, even taking both the Technos Arcade and Data East Arcade collections together, this is not a very impressive set of games. If you were to compare it to any of the popular retro mini consoles that were released over the last few years. Out of the box, with the Evercade VS Premium Pack, you're looking at about 7 acceptably good games for $120 to $130. That sucks. At the same time, however, it's not like any of the best retro mini consoles are even an option anymore, unless you're willing to pay way too much money to scalpers. And unlike retro mini consoles, the Evercade VS actually has a significant library of interchangeable cartridges that keeps growing all the time, and the prices for these cartridges are still reasonable. As of this trial, there are 30 Evercade cartridges, 28 of which are compatible with the Evercade VS. Most seem to be available on Amazon for about $20 a piece, but price hikes and scarcity are already starting to encroach on a library of games that are explicitly created in order to exploit the pathological tendencies of collectors. The Indie Heroes and Jalico Games collection, for instance, are both already harder to find and cost significantly more than other cartridges. As of right now, they cost at least 50% more, and I expect their price will continue to go up as interest in the Evercade expands. As a consequence, the choices for new games to play are simultaneously shrinking, even as Blaze continues to strive to publish new content for their console. Yet, almost every single remaining Evercade cartridge, excluding the Namco collections, suffer from a lack of quality must-play games that are exclusive to the Evercade ecosystem. Consider the fact that most of the games we enjoyed on the Data East collection can be purchased for a few bucks on the Switch as a digital download, including Bad Dudes, Burger Time, and Wizard Fire. For Blaze, this is a serious problem because many millions of people already have a Nintendo Switch, and this begs the question as to why anyone would ever bother with an Evercade, even if it is only $100. You might object that the Evercade is physical media that you can feel secure about hoarding for the future, but I'm not so sure. The Evercade's been highly dependent upon periodic digital downloads to function properly. So what will become of these physical collections when Blaze decides to move on and stop supporting the Evercade? Further, what's the point of physical media if it's grossly inferior to and more costly than digital media? Again, if you currently own a Nintendo Switch, getting an Evercade for access to retro games is a silly prospect. This is especially true if you subscribe to the Switch Online services, which give you access to a large library of NES, SNES, Genesis, and Nintendo 64 games that dwarfs the Evercade in terms of quality. Most of the best Jaleco games for the Evercade are already part of the Switch Online game library, for instance, and there are many good collections from top-tier companies like Capcom, Konami, SNK, and Namco that are already available across all consoles. And this applies to the Xbox and PlayStation ecosystems equally. If you just want to play good retro games, then the Evercade is not for you. One of the most prized Evercade cartridges released so far has been the Indie Heroes collection, a unique assortment of homebrew games made by developers functioning at or slightly above the level of hobbyists. But there really isn't much here that warrants spending money on. Another highly celebrated cartridge is the Mega Cat Studios Collection, Volume 1, which is composed of yet more homebrew games. Only these are all produced by Mega Cat and actually released as physical cartridges for both the NES and Genesis. This would be just as skippable as the Indie Heroes collection if not for the fact that it comes with Tanzer, a $50 Sega Genesis game from 2019 that is absolutely badass. Indeed, Tanzer is by far the best Evercade game that I've played across 5 different cartridges, and constitutes the closest thing to a must-have game available for the console. At $20, the Mega Cat Studios collection is a bargain solely on the merits of Tanzer. The Evercade is also a surprisingly cost-effective way to play the outstanding Xenocrisis and Tanglewood, both of which are bundled together on the same cartridge for $20. The Evercade VS is marketed as a low-cost alternative for retro gamers who miss the good old days of collecting physical media, but I think it's turned out to actually be a console for indie gamers looking for a cost-effective way to collect a wide assortment of homebrew and new old-school titles that were originally released as physical cartridges across an array of different old game consoles. Again, the Evercade isn't really free from the need for digital downloads to function properly. The physical boxes and manuals are all pretty low quality, and the assortment of retro games to play is kinda pitiful, unless you really love NES ports of British microcomputer games. But to date, the Evercade is both the cheapest and most convenient place to play new old games like Tanzer, Tanglewood, and Xenocrisis. And this is not a trivial advantage, because these games are legitimately awesome. It's just that, generally speaking, when it comes to the Evercade and its library of games, you're gonna have to slog through a lot of mediocrity before you get to the awesome. Therefore, Your Honor, we think the Evercade is innocent of the charges of mediocrity when approached from a certain point of view. As a retro console, yeah, it's a total joke. But when viewed as an indie homebrew super console, it's actually pretty rad. And indeed, it might even have a great future, maybe.
Very well. Not guilty.
Yes!
Will the defendant step forward and face the scales of justice? We, the Court of Higher Criticism, find the defendant, the Evercade VS, not guilty of being a steaming pile of trash. It is not bad.
You hear that, little buddy? You're not going to video game hell.
Yay! Hooray! Yay!
We're not finished.
Oh yeah, oops, sorry, Your Honor.
The Evercade VS is a nice-looking, well-built console with an excellent user interface and adequate controllers. It offers gamers on a budget a reliable and well-executed alternative to buying actual physical media in the highly inflated retro and indie game collectors market. It may be emulation, but the emulation is consistently of a high quality, and Blaze has been extremely vigilant about making improvements, correcting mistakes, and providing what seems to be exemplary customer service.
Dude, you sound like a legend.
However, the appeal of collecting Evercade games is greatly mitigated by the subpar packaging, pointlessly uninformative manuals, inaccurate button mapping, and wide assortment of depressingly mediocre games.
Uh-oh.
Therefore, while we do not find the Evercade VS guilty, we still cannot in good conscience recommend people buy this for $130. The games it comes with just aren't good enough on their own merits, and the best of them, such as Bad Dudes, can be found on other popular platforms for much cheaper. And so, we declare the Evercade VS to be on probation as a console that might be worth buying in the future, contingent upon there being a more robust library of games at a higher quality. The Evercade has had a lot of success with promoting independent developers. Perhaps somewhere out there is a group of upcoming game developers willing to make exclusive, and high-quality new retro-style games for the Evercade. If the Evercade were to get just a few more exclusive games that are just as good as Tanzer, then surely we would have to say that the Evercade VS is a must-buy, especially for fans of indie games, homebrews, or new games for old consoles. But as things stand, the Evercade is just shy of reaching that critical point. At the same time, it looks like the console has a promising future, and Blaze is clearly committed to turning this into a winner. The Morphcat Games collection that's coming soon to the Evercade is a good indicator that Blaze is already moving in the right direction. The Morphcat Games cartridge has Micro Mages, a well-polished brand new NES game that takes advantage of the Evercade's 4-player capabilities. If Blaze improves the quality of their boxes, improves their manuals, and released either Paprium or the Demons of Astaborg, then I definitely say that this is a must-have game console, even if they drop the multiple games per cartridge gimmick and focused on a higher quality presentation for each game. Many of us still like these kinds of games, and many of us still prefer physical media, but people want well-made and presentable physical media. These cheap shells and useless manuals don't cut it, nor does this generic box art. You're free to go, Evercade VS, for now.
Wow, thanks, mister.
But I have my eye on you, and I hope that renovation collection you've got is as good as it is weird. Maybe learn some decent button mapping, and look into getting Paprium. If you got that game, people would lose their minds. You've proven to be a cheap, reliable, well-made, and convenient alternative to owning a bunch of different original hardware. You may as well take advantage of that and give people access to these crazy homebrews that keep coming out. People want to play them, they just don't want to go through all the hassle. You, my friend, could be the solution.
Yippee! Whoa! Yay!
So what do you all think of the Evercade VS? Do you want one? Do you have one? If so, what are your favorite cartridges? Please let us know this and more in the comments. And thank you very much for watching. Later, dudes!